Okay, welcome to the last chapter of Unit Three. That's on the end of the Cold War, and now for this chapter, right? Basically, we are looking at how did the Cold War end, and it only ended because of the fall of communism. So, as we are looking at the factors for the end of the Cold War, basically, it's also looking at the factors of why the communism failed. So that's something that you can keep in mind while I'm going through this lecture. Like think about how did communism as an ideology not work? Because when we started off looking at the start of the Cold War, right, we're looking at competing ideologies. Okay, basically is democracy versus communism, and I've said this quite a few times that it's about whose idea is better. That was what the entire Cold War was about. Whose idea is better? Was it really democracy where people get to choose, or is it communism where people don't really get to choose and have things decided for you? Okay, so it's an idea by itself. How the countries implement the ideas are all very different. For example, Singapore's democracy is definitely very different from USA's democracy. Yeah, our democracy, some of the other countries even accuse Singapore of being a communist country because of the way that the government has kind of tight controls over certain things. So, like I said, it's really up to the country to interpret what kind of ideology they want to implement. So, it's the same thing for North Korea, who's communist today, Vietnam, who is still communist today, China, who is still communist today, and how they run communism. Okay, so it's an idea, right? So you start off from the start of the Cold War where you look at the competing ideologies, competing ideas. Which idea is better? So by the time we come to this chapter, you have the conclusion already that communism sucks. That's why it failed. That's why it brought about the end of the Cold War. Okay, but again, that is the communism specific to Soviet Union. Of course, when Soviet Union fell, communism fell in Soviet Union. It didn't fall in China, who were communists at the time. It didn't fall in Vietnam as well, and of course, our very beloved North Korea. Okay, so that's the thing that you can keep in mind while we are going through this entire chapter. You're just thinking about reasons why communism sucked. Okay. Right. So why did the Cold War end? Because of the fall of communism, as I've repeated multiple times. Okay. Now this gentleman that you see right there in the middle, he's a former actor, also known as the President of the United States towards the end of the Cold War. Okay, his name is Ronald Reagan. His role is, I guess, him as a person, his role could be pretty important. And also, I think I saw one question on SEQ about them asking, Ronald Reagan was responsible for the end of the Cold War. How far do you agree with the statement? Of course, the textbook and even excuse me, even the slides itself would not mention him quite a lot, lah. But you will definitely see his role popping up here and there somewhere around. Okay, so that's why they consider the questions here. They ask you who were the key figures during the last decade of the Cold War. So if you look at just people alone, we are looking at just two people, Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. However, of course, it's not just the last decade of the Cold War. That means to say the last, yeah, in case you didn't know, this decade means 10 years. Okay, it's not just the last 10 years of the Cold War, but also there were long-term and developments and also short-term developments, which actually is the last decade. That actually contributed to the failure of communism. Okay, of course, while I always talk about the failure of communism, right, it is synonymous with the end of the Cold War. But I think the SEQs, they will have more of a tendency to ask you about the end of the Cold War. Of course, it can go both ways, lah. Just remember to always answer the bloody question. Okay. Right, so we start off with the long-term factors. Then after that, move on to the short-term factors. Short-term factors are pretty straightforward, and you can really see the reasons why communism fell. But long-term factors would also contribute to it as well. Okay, so just to give you a very brief, extremely brief history. from like a 30 to 40 years that's, before communism actually fell. Okay, this is really very brief. Okay, so we start off with 1945. We don't have an actual start to the Cold War, but let's just mark it as the end of the World War II, which marked the start of the Cold War. So from 1945 onwards, you have the start of the Cold War, you have the Berlin blockade, 1949, and then after that you go on to Korean War, 1950 to 53. Then you have Cuban Missile Crisis in 62. 62, yes, 62, okay? And then after that, we are just going to go through very quickly now, 1960s and 70s, actually, what is happening before we hit the 1980s, where that is the time period that's very relevant to this chapter, and 1991, which is the fall of communism. Okay, to be honest, I don't really get this political cartoon. Okay, it's just simply indicating a driver of a tank, I assume, which is... No, it's not detente. I think it represents Soviet Union. There's a Soviet Union flag here. In the video, you might not be able to see it clearly. Okay, it's here. And then it runs over somebody which I presume are the US politicians. So after detente was temporary, they decided to, run them down again. So the message for the source, if I were to ask you this question, would be that it was the Soviet Union who abandoned detente. Okay? Yep. But this is not an SBQ chapter, just testing your SBQ skills, which you should be able to apply to every single chapter. Right, first of all, there's detente. Detente is a reduction of tensions between the two superpowers. So think of it like thawing of relations, okay? THAW. Like how you thaw a frozen chicken in the microwave. This is the thawing of the very cold relations. That's why it's called Cold War between USA and Soviet Union. Okay, the two superpowers. So 1970s, President Nixon, he was the one who practiced the policy of detente, and both superpowers, they accepted each other's sphere of influence and existence, and the the leader who was in charge of detente in the Soviet Union is Brezhnev. Okay, not Gorbachev yet. Brezhnev took over from Khrushchev, and after Brezhnev, there were actually, I think there was this guy called Andropov and another one more guy, I think one or two more before Gorbachev. Okay, so for Nixon and Brezhnev, the leaders of the superpowers in the 1970s, they entered negotiations and signed various treaties to limit nuclear arms and economic cooperation. Okay. Nixon himself is an interesting figure. You can go read up more if you're interested about the history of USA. He was involved in this Watergate scandal. Suddenly, I can't remember stuff. Yeah, but yes, he was involved in some kind of scandal that forced him to step down as president. But it was nothing to do with the Cold War, unfortunately. Okay. Right. So, as already mentioned, so Nixon and Brezhnev actually they went into some kind of negotiations to limit arms, because after the nuclear missile crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, they realized that if they keep doing this, sooner or later somebody's going to get bombed very badly. And if you remember, one of the lessons of Cuban Missile Crisis was to avoid a nuclear war at all costs, because the devastation and the consequences from a nuclear war, would be pretty devastating for both sides lah. Okay, so one of the things that they talked about was this thing called SALT. Without giving you this proper what it stands for, I think you can try to guess. It stands for actually Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Okay, and it's to limit and reduce the number of nuclear weapons. And SALT 1, that means to say that SALT 2 actually, 1972. Oh crap. My apologies for that. Right, so the second one is the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Limit number of anti-ballistic missile sites to 2 for each superpower. So there are all kinds of funny treaties. It's not as straightforward as, okay, I take away 10 missiles, you take away 10 missiles. Okay, there are many various types of treaties. Like for example, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Like is to ban testing on nuclear weapons so that you cannot develop even more nuclear weapons. Then, of course, there's different types of nuclear missiles. There's the short range, long range, medium range, as you have seen under the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there were various treaties to restrict the number of specific types of missiles. So there were a lot of them. Really a lot of all these kind of funny kinds of treaties. It's attempts at trying to limit something lah. You might say that there's no significance because nothing is really reduced. Like for example, a nuclear test ban treaty doesn't reduce the number of nuclear missiles, just reduce the testing, which prevents you from producing more advanced missiles. But you can actually just produce, old age technology missiles and thousands of them and millions of them, and you can't stop them. So yes, there's a limitation to these kind of treaties, but it shows the willingness of both sides to try to negotiate and try to calm things down a little bit more. That's why it's détente. All right. In the Vietnam War, USA got the help of the Soviet Union to convince communists in Vietnam to negotiate a peace treaty with the USA. For the elective students who don't take this one, USA basically lost the Vietnam War. Nobody would admit it because they are so proud to think that they can actually lose a war, but they did. Okay, and so I guess they engaged Soviet Union to help them to ask North Vietnamese communists to negotiate a peace treaty with them. Okay, then the trade and economic part of it, Soviet Union agreed to repay World War II debts to USA. Everybody owes USA money due to World War I and World War II. And USA allowed the Soviet Union to purchase large supplies from them. I have no idea large supplies of what, but I'm sure it's not missiles. Okay. But the détente didn't last long. And Jimmy Carter, the next president, after taking over from Nixon, he was tough towards communism. And USA and Soviet Union also sent aid to opposing groups during the Angolan Civil War. Angola is a country in Africa. And there was opposition over the Western Bloc from the Western Bloc over Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. If you had listened to my lessons, you would have seen me showing you the very modern pictures of Afghanistan. That was in the 1970s. Unfortunately, due to Soviet Union's invasion, they have well, how to put this? They have been reversed in modernity. Yeah, it was quite a unfortunate thing to happen to them. Okay, so all these affected the relations between the two superpowers, also ended the period of détente. So basically, right, okay, this actually we haven't actually started on the long-term developments contributing to the end of the Cold War. But this is, like I said, to give you a very brief summary of what happened in the 1960s after Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, we are looking at the point from after Cuban Missile Crisis that détente started. I mean, obviously, right, it was the height of the tensions in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 60s, 70s, with Nixon around, the thing kind of died down a little bit to help both sides. Okay, so that I will conclude the very first part of this chapter here. And hopefully I can complete this in another 2 more lectures, maybe, or 15-minute blocks each, or it might go on even further. All right, so please move on to the next lecture for the long-term developments contributing to the end of the Cold War.